here for Thrifty Notion to bring you the second video in our Textile Talk series, which is where we start at the absolute basics of fibers and fabrics, and over time we'll be diving deeper into anything you could possibly want to know about textiles, how they're made, what they're made out of, how that impacts the end use of the fabric, and things like that. So today we're going to be talking about the three main ways that fabrics are produced and how they are classified based on that. So the three categories of fabrics are woven, knits, and non-woven. So starting with wovens, as the name suggests, they are produced through weaving on a loom, and there are two threads or yarns used in the process of weaving a fabric. There are warp threads, which are placed on the loom first, and these are placed vertically, and then the weft yarns are woven throughout those, and they go horizontally across the fabric from selvage to selvage. So how the weft yarns are woven into the fabric will determine the weave pattern, and that's what determines kind of the end look of the fabric and how it behaves. It can really impact the overall properties, but things like yarn thickness and fiber content also affect the end fabric as well. So the main thing you need to know about wovens right now is that they are made through weaving. They are generally non-stretch fabrics. However, they sometimes do have stretch if they have spandex, lycra, or latex woven into them. That'll be part of the yarn, so it'll make the yarn stretchy overall, and then that will, in the end, make the fabric stretchy as well. I have a few woven fabrics here just to show you how different they really can be. This first one is a very lightweight cotton lawn, so it's very drapey and thin. Then I have this linen blend fabric. It has a really cool raised stripe because it was woven with some thicker yarns throughout, and that gave it that texture and really cool appearance as well. Denim and flannel are two more great examples of woven fabrics, and these two are actually both twill weaves. So if you look really close, you can see that they have a little bit of a diagonal pattern to the weave, and that's something that we'll talk about more when we discuss weave patterns specifically. And last but not least, satin is another lovely woven fabric, and so you can see that there are so many different fabrics that fall within the category of wovens. We have fancy fabrics that are a little bit more delicate like satin, but denim and flannel and more hard-wearing fabrics are also found in this category. Next up are knit fabrics, and again, like the name suggests, these are produced through knitting, and it's just like you would knit a sweater with knitting needles, but instead there are machines that will knit yardage of fabric, and then sometimes within apparel companies they also can have things hand knitted as well. So the biggest difference between wovens and knits are that in a woven fabric the yarns are interlocking by going over and under one another, and in a knit fabric they're looping around each other and looping through each other. So this means that the yarns in a knit fabric are going to have more space to move around. They have more give to them. They're not as locked down by that knit as they would be in a woven fabric, and so most knits are going to have some stretch to them because of this. It's really that they just move, the threads move around within themselves, and that allows for some stretch, but it can also have stretch because of the type of knit pattern used. The exception to this would be stable knits, and these are just knits that don't have any stretch at all. The cool thing about stable knits is that because they have no stretch, you can use some different techniques on them, and if you're working with a sewing pattern that calls for a woven fabric, you may actually be able to substitute a stable knit if you want to. Obviously, this is up to your discretion and kind of playing around with it, but it is a fun thing to try out because knits can have a completely different feel to them. They tend to be drapier than woven fabrics just because of how they're made, but obviously there are exceptions to that as well because there are some very drapey wovens, and fiber content does play a big role in that. But I just think it's cool that stable knits can kind of go either direction. You don't want to use a stable knit for a knit pattern that calls for stretch, but you can sometimes use stable knits on woven patterns. Some examples of knit fabrics are a rib knit, which has this raised texture to it, and they're usually very stretchy because of this knit pattern. There are also knits like these that have just a very flat texture to them. But as you can see, they can come in many different weights and thicknesses. This one is a rayon knit, so it's very drapey and very thin. This one, on the other hand, is a wool knit, so it's got a little bit more thickness to it, and it's also more plush. Like when you squeeze it, you can feel it compress under your fingers, and it's just really nice and cozy. So this one is more of an open knit, and as you can see, it's a little bit sheer. It has bigger spaces between the knit pattern, and it actually doesn't have much stretch at all. And if I hold it up really close, you might be able to see some of the loops in the knit pattern. So seeing those loops is how you can determine that this is a knit and not a woven. The last category of fabrics are non-woven fabrics, and the name is actually a little bit misleading because this is just a catch-all category for any fabric that is not only non-woven but also not knitted. So this category includes things like leather, felt, and vinyl. And that is because of how these textiles are obtained or produced. And so leather is an animal hide, so it obviously is not woven or knitted. Felt is produced through felting, and that just means laying out all of the fibers in a flat sheet and compressing them and using needles to push them into one another and get them to bind together to form that flat sheet of fibers. And vinyl is essentially just a sheet of plastic. So sometimes you can find vinyl fabrics that have a thin layer of knit fabric on the back, but then they're coated in that plastic on top. And then other times, like in the case of clear vinyl, it'll really just be a sheet of plastic. So that's what this category is. There are obviously other things that fall into this category, and we'll talk about those more in a future video as well. All right, you guys, that's all for today. Thank you so much for being here. Next week will be part 1, talking about weave patterns. So we'll discuss the 4 most common weave structures and how those impact the end properties of the fabric. I hope to see you guys here, and happy sewing!